Yeah, I think it's good to start now.
Okay, so if you could start recording, and I would like to.
Yeah.
To share with people that we met at the IO Active holiday party.
Yep.
Correct? And we started talking about the importance of security and how it really begins at the software level, but then you pointed out that there are the whole platforms of security responsibilities. So with that, I am going to turn the presentation over to you, and Kina, it is being recorded, correct? Yes. Thank you.
Well, hello, everyone. Hopefully I'm coming through loud and clear and everything's working correctly. Anyway, I really appreciate the opportunity to have a chance to talk a little bit about something I'm seeing in terms of a real change, and there's a real sea change in the way we're having to think about security and where security is taking us, and especially in terms of how we do secure development, deployments, and the whole area of what you would call, or known colloquially as DevSecOps, and what all that means in terms of developing, putting in infrastructure, and making all that work, and how that comes about. And as I say, there's some big sea changes that have come. Just a little bit about me. I'm currently a CISO. Before that, I was the director, sorry, I can't even remember my own biography, the chief security strategist for Microsoft. Before that, I did Microsoft Live OneCare. I was part of the team that did Windows Security Center that incorporated into Windows XP, SP2. Before that, I was the CIO of McAfee. So I'm doing security for a very long time, and both an operational level, and at both the software and as a software development, and as an operational level, as an IT professional, as well as a manager and advising folks on how best to do security and what security development means. I helped put together several standards in terms of financial services, the BITS software standard, the work I did with ISO. I was part of the team that was helping to put together the ISO standard for secure software development, et cetera. So there's been a lot of work that we've done in thinking about, how do you teach developers to do security? And what's happened is, just in the last few months, this has just been in the last, I'd say, it's been coming for about 2 years, but in the last 6 months, it's accelerated. In this quarter, it's really starting to accelerate a huge sea change in terms of security and what's happening with security in terms of new mandates that are coming down. They're going to have a huge impact in terms of how we think about doing secure development, where that takes us. So just briefly, just a level set, these are slides that I've shown for years and years and years. So there's nothing new here in terms of threats, but we just have to think about them to get an idea of what kind of landscape we're covering. We have a problem with a lot of IDs and where that goes. This is passwords, this is crypto, this is tokens, this is passkeys, this is a bunch of different IDs that we have, and how do we manage all of those and carry us through? We have a pretty challenging threat landscape that's not getting any better. We have pretty sophisticated criminals. We just had the latest Chinese intrusion on critical infrastructure that's been going on for 5 years that was just ferreted out. We got a real issue with an epidemic of ransomware. But these sorts of issues are not new. We've had these spywares, toolkits, and attacks all across the stack that have been going on for years. So I could be giving this, I've given this talk 10 years ago, and this landscape wouldn't have changed. It's just gotten to be more sophisticated and deeper and wider, but it's still the same issues that we're combating in terms of what's out there. Something I like to emphasize to folks is that, and this goes true with software development, as well as with when you're thinking about topologies and infrastructure and doing architecture, is that we have a lot of noise in our infrastructure. We have things coming and going, we have a lot of things happening, and as a result, we wind up with this whole graph that you see here, what most IT systems look like. And when you have small signal and large noise by science, that makes it hard to see what's going on. So we have to think about ways that we can get rid of the noise, because that's where the bad guys hide. They hide in that noise. I mean, that's the essence of, if you think about it, living off the land, which was this whole issue with the the latest Chinese effort that the FBI identified was they were living off the land, but what they in essence were doing was they were hiding in the noise. And that's the place where they lurk, and we have to make sure we can identify it. We will never get rid of it, but at least if we can identify it, we know that that's the place to pay attention to, as opposed to the good stuff, the signal, and where that happens. The other thing we have to think about when we're writing software is, where do security issues occur? And in all my career, everywhere I've seen a security issue, without fail, it's been where there's been a seam. It's where two things come together and where they meet. And if you look in the slide here, you'll see that, in the sophisticated infrastructure, where's the problem going to happen? It's going to happen right there at that seam where two things meet, because that's usually the weakest point. That's usually the point where somebody can get in and either go, and traverse and then do a privilege escalation and get into your infrastructure. So think about seams, and that goes into the threat modeling, which I'll talk about in terms of when we do software architecture. You heard a lot of the discussion lately about zero trust, and that's really important. And I like to think about it in terms of the fact that if you've got physical security, you've got a lot of different segmented layers that you have in place that provide that security for those core assets that are in that safe in the middle. And we need to have those as well. And in terms of our infrastructure and our topology, we have to think about, what are we doing that creates these different segmented areas that we make sure that there's no trust between them, so that we can be sure that the people who are actually getting that sensitive data storage, or who are moving to that ring zero of trust, are not going to be the bad guys. And so that's another part of that, which gets again to the threat modeling aspect of both the architecture and the software that we write. The point I was bringing up about accountability has really gotten to be a pretty important one. Just this last few months ago, on October 30, the SEC charged both SolarWinds and the Chief Information Security Officer for fraud and internal control failures relating to allegedly known cybersecurity risks and vulnerabilities. So they're not holding people accountable for the fact that they knew better and misrepresented their security risks and vulnerabilities. And you think, well, that's just front office stuff. Oh, no. This is stuff that matters in terms of if they had had a better process around understanding and knowing who was doing security, how they were doing security, and the SDL that goes with that, then that would be their sort of bulwark against the allegation that they committed risk and fraud and misrepresented it, because they could point to it and say, well, I have a program in place that does that, and my developers are developing against that, and that's my accountability and attestation that I'm doing the right things. And so responsibility has arrived. It can't just be to say, we used to go, oops, and here's your patch. That isn't going to play anymore. There has to be more to it. And even more interesting is, this is the latest guidelines that just came out from the Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative the DOJ is now starting to do. And what they're going to be prosecuting, and this is legally, criminally prosecuting people for putting U.S. information systems, if you're selling to the government, knowingly providing deficient security services or products, misrepresenting cybersecurity practices or protocols, or knowingly violating obligations to monitor and report. And so your only defense against that is going to be if you've got some kind of policy and procedure and program in place to cover all this. Again, just saying, well, I did the best effort isn't going to play anymore. It has to be a known program with known results and known outcomes, or else you're now going to be in the firing line as far as accountability, both at the corporate level and at the personal level. So that's why this is really important to pay attention and to think about what the process is and how you're doing it. In terms of security investment, I always like to level set on this, because this is kind of important. We typically invest the same amount, whether it's important data or not so important data. Maybe a little bit, but we're not. And the problem with that is that really puts us in this position where, I like this quote, if you protect paper clips and diamonds with equal vigor, you'll soon have more paper clips and fewer diamonds. And so we really need to be adjusting our investment models, so we're investing more in terms of how we're protecting the more important data, and also putting into place structures and process like a security development lifecycle for our developers, for our architecture, for our topology, so that we're actually making sure we're insulated against these issues that are going to arise because of the fact that we now have attestations that are required. We now have the risk that's out there of being prosecuted. So we need to treat security more like other parts of the business where we have risk models, where we think and we try to mitigate it, we either outsource it, accept it, or reject it, but we have some process in place where we identify it and know what's going on, and we talk about investments and returns. What is our core value prop? What is the most important things that we're doing? And really importantly, what are my legal obligations? Because that's now something that has to be factored in every time we're writing new code and putting it out there. And just because you're doing it with a GPL or an open source license, that gives you some insulation, but it doesn't help the person upstream from you. So in other words, you can't control who uses your software, and so you can say, well, I have no obligation. But that person who is upstream using your software does have an obligation. So they're going to start talking to you about, well, I'm worried about your process. I'm worried about how vulnerable your code is. So this has implications for the open source system, not just for proprietary closed source software. So this is broader than just one element of that. It has ramifications all through the GPL and OSS input, not the GPL, but through the whole open software ecosystem and how that comes through. And so we need to be thinking about this and where we're investing, how we're investing, and what we're doing in terms of putting processes in place to help us make sure that this is as secure as we can possibly make it. Something I always like to really harp on is identity is probably your biggest risk. And identity has many-fold. Identity is not just you as a person logging in. It's also your application identity. It's your hardware identity. It's your identity of your software stack. There's lots of different dimensions to this identity problem, and so we want to make sure we're covering all those dimensions. But most importantly, passwords must die. I think we're actually making progress with passkeys. I think there's actually a path forward with that, but that's got to be done. PKI can be made human friendly. We need more crypto in our environment, and that's the only thing that's going to save us. Biometrics are here, but we're becoming problematic. We're already seeing where there's issues with it, so we need to be careful about what we're doing. And then, as I say, I think passkeys are something that's going to carry us forward, and we can already do things like SSH with passkeys, and that gives us now a portable way of doing, in essence, a strong authentication that's cryptographically based, and make it easy for people to do. Facial, in terms of biometrics, facial ID has already been problematic, and voice especially has been problematic with the AI. There's been a lot in the news about this in terms of faking voice and whatnot. And so you can't depend on those old methods. I mean, it used to be you called up your help desk and could tell them, hey, it's me, fix my password. That can't work anymore because it's just too easy to now spoof that and to go around it. And there are methods that we can make crypto user-friendly. As I say, we've got now these enclaves for passkeys in different methods that we have to do that. We've got two-factor hardware authentication. We've had, the old the old PIV, the smart card system that's been out there for 20 plus years. That's one of the ways Microsoft has been able to assure their code stack has been that they've used smart cards for years and years and years to be very careful about what sorts of software gets checked into that stack and be able to have controls around that. And that's something that everybody has to do now. Is they have to worry about, what am I doing? Everybody should have SSH and should be signing code that they push to GitHub. And that's really important that you've got, some sort of code kind of certificate. With Let's Encrypt and the other technologies that are out there now, it's become very easy for you to have a publicly certifiable PKI without having to spend a lot of money on it that you can use for code signing that's repeatable so that you can identify who it is and where it is, and we can have some sense of identity around that code that you have out there. And so it's incumbent on all of us to think about, what are we doing to sign our code, to create that identity, and then to create things like SBOMs, which give us a audit trail against that whole, supply chain of where that software came from and all the component pieces that go with it. Just briefly, corporations have identity too. You need to think about your DNS, making sure your DNS is secure, especially when you talk about spam and email, things like that. Investments in PKI are important, and working in terms of mail is still one of the major opportunities for bad things to happen, and so we need to make sure we're protecting that, and that hardware security modules have come down in price. They're available in the cloud. There's really no reason why we can't do more in terms of using HSMs and that sort of technology to protect our assets. In terms of attacks and mitigations, this is stuff, again, that's been true for 10 years plus. It's just the nature of it's changed, but the same mitigations are there. It really comes down to configuration management, patching, whitelisting, identity in terms of flavor of digital signature, and also in terms of blacklisting and tunneling. Tunneling and segmentation, and making sure that you have the defendable border that you can keep folks out that don't belong, and that you can keep out software that doesn't belong, and you know what's out there. So again, this comes down to being identity, good security practices, and in making sure that we can truly know where stuff is coming from and where it's going. In terms of, as I was alluding to before about open source, we're now very heavily dependent on it. Even in proprietary software, there's a lot of open source software that's in it. It's everywhere, and it's growing, and it's got dependency hell that goes with it. So how do we think about that, and what do we need to do is important. Like, who supports and fixes it? And then equally important and scary is everyone has a fuzzer and knows how to use it. So now it's very easy, especially in terms of some of the AI stuff that I've seen, to be able to go through and enumerate vulnerabilities in code through an AI-based fuzzer, and be able to find those places where there's leaks and buffer overflows, et cetera, that you can then exploit and create vulnerabilities to then be able to go in and get privilege escalation and do bad stuff. So you can't just depend that the many eyes is going to solve this. It isn't. It helps, but it isn't. You have to think about what you're going to do about it. And so what can you do about it? Inventory it. That's where SBOMs or software bill of materials become very important. Keep the variations down for the same task. Everyone likes the other library, so there's like 15 different libraries doing the same thing. The problem with that is the more you proliferate, the harder it is to keep track of what's out there. So keeping them down to a rational, manageable number of things that you're working with is really important and very critical. Have a patch and version strategy in place in terms of what it is you're doing, how you're advancing it, how you have to roll it back if you have to, and what that means. And then have a plan for how you're going to handle dependencies and knowing what those dependencies are. We're working through that SBOM to understand that and making sure that that doesn't become an issue. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've done a lot of development in Node, and that dependency hell is just really bad in Node. And that's a place where, again, you got to run the audit controls and different things there's tools in there that you can use to help make sure that the node that you're putting together is going to be correct and it has all the right places, all the right pieces in it, and that you can support the different versions, and you don't wind up with something that's out of date or vulnerable in that. And then you have a support replacement strategy that you have to be in place. And as I've mentioned, a software bill of material can help, and that's important to think through. Really briefly, this is in the last, I'd say 5 years, but in the last 2 years and in the last 6 months, it's really accelerated. But we just need to think about artificial intelligence in terms of how we think about threat modeling and what we're doing. The whole concept of verification has become really important. What is true and what isn't true, and how we do that is something we really have to think about, because now it becomes very easy for someone to manipulate the way we used to verify things. And so we have to make sure that that's the case. And also in terms of the data and the large language models we're using that provide into that, the different software that uses that, how do we verify it? How do we prevent manipulation? That's a huge area that I'm worried about with artificial intelligence, because we've already shown that people can manipulate large language models that don't validate inputs and don't verify inputs, that they can make it be racist, they can make it do things that weren't anticipated, and have it go off and veer in different directions. And so that's a big problem that we need to worry about, as well as control. Where's it going? Who can make changes? How does that get incorporated into the model? How do we make sure the model isn't pulling in information that is tainted in some form, and making sure that's then going to be reliable? Because if we're depending on this to make important decisions for us, we have to make sure that we can have some faith that that's where it is. And so that means a lot of archiving and benchmarking and things that go with that. And so these now are incumbent on a developer, if they're now taking advantage of these LLMs, that they have to be thinking about these issues as well. And it's not just the case, well, I have secure APIs and I've got a great token, so I'm good to go. You have to think about the data that's backing up that's forming part of your application, and that large language model you're leveraging and what that means and where that's going to take you. And it's incumbent on you to manage that and think about that. Your vendor may give you a lot of help on that and give you all the pieces you need or tools you need to carry you through on that. But you still have to have that responsibility and think about that. So very important new area that's coming up in terms of thinking about threat modeling and secure development and where that takes us. In terms of DevOps and AppSec, I really advocate for a service-based architecture. The reason being is that it's more flexible in terms of where you do it and how you do it. And in a lot of cases, there's things that are better off outsourcing because they may be more secure, maybe more structured from what you have internally. So and also it makes for a lot more clarity of the infrastructure, so that you can make sure that you're not getting stuff that's tangled up. Also, you can isolate legacy things with dependencies and make that dependency more manageable, so that you can be able to say that put that in a contained environment, and then you can restrict access or how that gets interacting with the rest of your environment, so that you can make sure that the appropriate level of attention is being paid to the most vulnerable things, and that really helps. And so having that service architecture in anyone is really important for that. It's also a contained environment, so you can isolate anomalies. So if there's something weird going on, it's very easy to segment it off and then look at it and say, hey, wait a minute, where is the issue coming from? Either from something unconstrained that's an artifact, or something that's an attack that's actively happening. And then you can whitelist via digital signatures, which is really important in terms of the component pieces and how that comes together, and what data flows happen inside of that architecture. And then it leads itself to network segmentation, which is very important, as I say, to being able to understand anomalies, to monitor, to have agents looking into what's going on. And you can decentralize your risk. And in doing that, you're going to save money. So there's the dollars and cents to go with that. And the ways to do this all have their pros and cons. There's, of course, containers, VMs, cloud services, all have different benefits. And at the end of the day, even in terms of environment that I'm running, it's a mix. I have some cloud services, I have some VMs, I have some containers. And this depends on what I'm doing, that those are the different ones that are appropriate for those different instances. Just briefly, I think this is important, but there's a hierarchy to segmentation that we need to think about in terms of user segmentation. There's a coarse ground segmentation around the network and hypervisors and making sure that there's a good separation there. Then we have micro-segmentation in terms of application tiers and workloads and what happens. And then there's even a nano segmentation in terms of, okay, I'm going to have a protocol going to different locations and different processes and different containers. And so if we do this, then that gives us different entry points to be able to put up barriers or to isolate or to monitor, to be able to find where the bad guys are and to be able to build out our threat models and our thoughts about how we're going to mitigate this in the architecture and in the code we write better. As I've said, all of this goes into our thinking and our design around the architecture we're going to run it and the code we actually write, because the code we actually write is not independent of this. You're going to make different design decisions based on if you have nano segmentation than if you've got everything just dumped into one bucket in terms of a large VM or a bare bones workstation somewhere. And so, if you think about these issues up front and you architect it in as part of the development process, then it makes this doing a nano segmentation that much easier. So these things are very synergistic. You need to be aware of the architecture that then flows back into your coding, and that makes a big difference in terms of how secure it comes through and what that means. In terms of segmentation strategies, as I say, segmenting the network, segmenting the hypervisor, doing native firewalls are all good examples of different sorts of segmentations that happen at those different tiers that I was talking about that we're going through there. And then we are migrating VMs to containers. Containers really provide a nice way to provide some better isolation than VMs per se. Not to say that you can't make VMs secure, it's just that you carry this extra burden of a guest OS around with you, which containers don't, and so that gives you a little more isolation and less infrastructure to worry about, and so that's important. We talked a bit about DevSecOps, but also, configuration management is really important. In fact, at least 85% of targeted cyber intrusions in Australia in 2017 could have been mitigated by doing just 4 mitigation strategies around whitelisting applications and doing patching around your different line of business applications you have, patching operating system vulnerabilities, minimizing the number of users with administrative privileges, and doing a defense in depth segmentation strategy. And so, I mean, really, again, it's not, there's no silver bullets, there's no easy answers. What it comes down to is doing a segmented, in-depth strategy of in terms of how you put together your infrastructure and these different steps that you go through to do that, and that's very important. In terms of secure application development, I'm really a strong proponent of get a secure development process and build an education around it. I was deeply involved in Microsoft security development lifecycle. I strongly believe that that's a great program that's made a lot of demonstrable results both in and out of Microsoft, and I would heartily recommend it to anyone. But there's other programs out there that people have done. There's the NIST secure development lifecycle, which draws heavily from the SDL. There's BSIM has got a lot of different practices that they use that does SDL-like processes around that. OWASP, I think, has some other SDL-like practices that they do. So there's a lot of different places you can look. Certainly the ISO standard that is structured around the SDL, I would hardly recommend. I don't remember this number off the top of my head. I'll post it later, but I can definitely recommend the ISO standard as being the kind of the gold standard that you can point to about a secure development process and doing that. If you have a secure development process, you can't just do it at the end. You have to do it from the very beginning, because if you don't do it from the beginning, then you miss all the benefits from doing the threat modeling and all that architectural thinking and work up front, that then you can reap the benefits later in terms of how you incorporate it and deploy this into your code, into your infrastructure, and where it goes. You have to provide tooling to help with the process. You can't just depend on developers to do this all on paper. So you have to have we all have automation chains now, Jenkins or GitLab or well, the different ones that are out there. But there's a lot of help and a lot of tooling we can do that do things like static code analysis, even automated fuzzing that happens as part of that automation chain, which are important to have as part of your process. And then you need to make the criteria clear, measurable, and attainable. You have to be able to give developers the ability to know they're on track, that they are making progress against the goals that you set out for them, and that those goals are reasonable. And so this has to meet where your organization is in terms of its journey, and then you have to keep continually improving the process and moving through. And as you do that, what you're going to do is there'll be some upfront cost, but at the end of the day, you'll reap that back in terms of lower back-end costs, fewer vulnerabilities and things like that, which all have a cost associated with them. So people argue, well, I'll just take the cost later when the vulnerability happens. Well, then it turns out that cost is inevitably larger than if you've done it up front and done the right things in terms of making sure that you've got a good program in place. And then support of all management is absolutely critical. But we're now in a new world where having a documented process is something you have to now think about, because that's going to be your main shield from financial and criminal liability, because you can point to it and say, this is the process we use, this is how we follow the process, here's the artifacts to show that and archives to show that we did do the process, and that's going to be your defense when when something hits the fan, because that's where the world is going now. Is that it's not just a nice to have, it's a must have for a lot of different agencies and people in the world. Just to talk again about the Microsoft SDL, it comes down into some big chunks that are really sort of make it intuitive when you think about them. Number one is you teach people what to do and how to do it, so they know how to write secure code. They know about things like buffer overflows. They know about validating inputs. They know about whitelisting. They know about all the things they need to do. You have a set of good requirements and gates and bug bars that allow them to be able to know that that's what they have to meet to be able to get where they need to go. In the design process, you do the threat modeling and think it through in terms of, well, what architecture am I going to run this on? Where am I going to have it? How am I going to design it and do it? You've got implementation tools. You've got the ability to have static code analysis. You've got the ability to have the way to know that you're using maybe banned functions or things that are not as secure as they could be, and so you could run through those tools and find those obvious things and be able to get those out of the system. And, even linting is an improvement because I will maybe identify things where there's bad process that you need to fix. So it can be very simple tools, but those are important tools to be able to make sure that your implementation is done correctly. There's a verification stage where, as I've alluded to, you do dynamic and fuzz testing, manual peer code reviews. There's no replacement for having your peers sit down and do a code review with you, and to make sure that they are checking against the different criteria and bug bars that we have in terms of thinking through where that goes, and also verifying did you actually mitigate your threat models and and minimize your attack surface. That's really important. And then something that often gets lost is the release plan. And what that means is that you already are planning about if there is a vulnerability that is identified, how are we going to respond to that? Do we have an archive of everything that we've done and all the process that goes into that? You need to archive not just the code itself, but also how do we arrive and make these decisions? Because then that makes it much easier to go back and understand why it's architected the way it is. And then that gives you learnings to take back then to go into the next reiteration on that piece or a new software. So this whole process, synergistically is really important. And there's a lot of detail in the ISO standard and in the SDL that I'd encourage you to look at that goes through in terms of each of these different steps. But at the high level, these are the really critical steps that you need to think about. And it all starts with training. So congratulations, you guys are all learning about secure code development, learning about thinking about cybersecurity. So that's a good step on this road. And then these other pieces of requirements, design, implementation, verification, release, and response are all parts of that journey in which you're going to learn more about and are going to be important in terms of carrying you through that journey. And if you think about secure development, we're getting to 100% is where a lot of money gets spent. This is where you think about things that are military grade are going to be obviously more expensive than things that are consumer grade. And so this is where you have to think about what are the really critical pieces I need to worry about, and then investing your resources appropriately. That was that diamonds, another thing I was talking about earlier, that you need to be careful about where you're doing that and what you're doing and how you're doing that. So you need to be allocating your resources appropriately in terms of how you prioritize your risk. This is a slide I borrowed because I love it in terms of how it shows why a software bill of materials is important. What a software bill of materials is basically it gives you a breakdown of all of the component pieces that make up a piece of software. So in essence, there was a big issue with one open source library called Log4j, which was used to provide logging services that people incorporated in as part of their applications. That was an open source that had a vulnerability in it. And so everyone that used that was vulnerable. Another one very recently was the WebP in Chrome was another example of this, where there was another piece of software that was vulnerable. And so you need to think about how you detail that out. And there's tools and standards and templates and formats for how this comes about. But what happens is that why it's important is we consume those SBOMs in a lot of different ways. We consume them in terms of doing this development lifecycle, which I was just talking about, identifying, well, I got these libraries and these other things that I'm bringing into my application, and those are things that are going to be important in terms of making sure that they don't, turn out to be problematic. They're important in terms of my supply chain, in terms of things that are downstream of me. Are they vulnerable, and what that means? It comes important in terms of vulnerability management, because now if I have a WebP or a Log4j or some other issue that arises, I can identify which parts are vulnerable, or if I do have a vulnerability, and then that feeds into my risk management. And so this is going to be a much more important piece, and it's now been required as now the government is requiring that when you provide software to them, and it doesn't matter whether it's proprietary or open source, it has to have a software bill of materials associated with it. And so what's happening is now we're seeing this cascading effect where the people upstream are now saying, I need an SBOM from you. And the open source providers are starting to look to different third parties to say, hey, can you do an SBOM for me? I'll do it myself. But now that's being a requirement that they need, that sort of library around open source. And so it's cascading down to where this is going to be more and more of a requirement as time goes on in terms of having those SBOMs as part of these downstream libraries and open source. Vulnerability identification automation is one of the huge benefits that pop out from this, because now I know all the different pieces that are in my software. I've got a way to parse it. And so now I can go and if a vulnerability is reported, I can know, does this CVE match up against an SBOM that's critical for what I'm trying to do. And so that's important to know. There's also formal accountability for vulnerabilities. And so what that does is it says that we can, especially if it's open source, we can say, the person I need to talk to is X and not some other organization that may not have formal accountability. And so what that does is that gives me a way to be able to tie things back, to get the right person involved, and to make sure I'm getting the fixes from the right source. Because there's many people that may put out fixes, which may or may not be what you want in terms of long-term stability of whatever it is you're trying to fix. And then this gives you that attestation that there's accountability for content and process, that somebody's gone through and made that SBOM, they've identified what's in there, and so that's now starting us down that path of being able to know where it's coming from, and identifying code provenance, and being sure that we know that it's coming from well-established supply chains. Attestation is being driven down, as I've said, both in the proprietary and open source, and that risk is being pushed down. So what this is doing is it's trying to get the risk to the right folks, to making sure that it's doing the right thing, and that this is going to be required, as I say, to protect companies and individuals from prosecution, because you're going to need that SBOM to show that you're using stuff that has been supported with the right processes and implementation, that I can attest to say that it is doing the right things around security and not just something that's random. So I've got some key principles that I think are important to think about, that I always do when you think about secure development and secure implementations in architecture. Blocking always supersedes monitoring. If you can segment and block something, that's much better than monitoring it. This is reducing your attack surface and making sure that you're not creating an issue there. Gray space is acceptable. There are things that you may say are low risk, and you may have some gray space, but it has to be on your terms. It can't be the case that it's unknown, or that risk isn't understood and mitigated. You can only monitor if you know what normal is. If you don't have a baseline, if you don't know what normal is in an infrastructure or within an application and how it works, then you're never going to find an anomaly, because you don't know what a normal is. So that's really important if you could do that. Of course, anomalies are always more interesting than conformities, so making sure you're alerting on the right things is really important. And analytics must drive action, but it's only as good as your data. So if your data sucks, then you're not going to be able to go far with it. And your data is only as good as its vetting. That goes back to that AI issue I was mentioning earlier, that if your data in your large language model is either in an automated fashion or in a direct manipulation fashion poor, then all your outcomes are going to be poor. It's the garbage in, garbage out. The AI doesn't get a pass on that. And so you need to be very careful about thinking through what happens there. A value trumps topology, in terms of, I think I need to think about where my most important stuff is, and then making sure that my topology works with that or around it, and doesn't create issues. Identity and architecture, segmentation matter, which we talked about at length in terms of how we think through this. And process accountability and procedures also matter. Your software development lifecycle, your SBOM, how you're archiving. One of the big issues that are tied into the NIST standards and into the new standards that are coming into place is that you have to have things archived, and you have to be able to have good archives that you can put back to show that you're tracking the process and you know where things are. So that's important as well. And that doesn't matter whether you're an individual developer or a corporation. That archiving matters, and that's where Git and signing code and Git and having cryptographic controls around Git are important. And then finally, attestation and liability is here. Your processes must reflect that. I'm sorry, to say that, and as I say, different levels have different concerns about that. But that's where the world we live in now, is that we're now in that realm of where that is important, and we need to think through what that means. That's the end of my formal presentation, but I'm not sure if we can open it up to questions and to go through. I normally would stop and take questions, but being that this was a sort of a directed environment, I wanted to make sure I got through the material, and then hopefully as I went along, folks could have an opportunity to think about things that I may be able to clarify or could give more context to, and then I can answer questions. So I'm open for doing that now.
I have some questions, Doug.
Oh, go ahead,
Morgan,
Clark.
go ahead. Okay.
Well,
okay.
You start, Clark.
Okay. It was. Thank you so much.
Sure.
You've talked about security in like across a lot of different points in the organizations. First question is for the Log4j. We've dealt with that with eBay before. But I'm just curious, what if there wasn't a fix for that yet? And there's a lot of Java systems that are very vulnerable for that. But then again, I was thinking, like you were saying, containing the system. But before we even do that, it should have been like your backend application should not be exposed to outside, right?
Right, and that's where that topology matters, the segmentation, and all of that matters, because that's sort of your backstop. If you can't get the vulnerability resolved immediately, at least you can now restrict access. But knowing that you have a Log4j problem is is kind of step one in some ways, and that's where the SBOM and that software accountability comes in, because in that sense, I know now I've got Log4j living in this particular application that I have there, and so now I need to put mitigation measures around the network or ports or application proxies or whatever to protect it against that vulnerability until it gets patched.
I guess you're right. What helped us in eBay before was there was already like an automation wherein it discovered Log4j across all the system and created a bug ticket.
Right, and it's great if you have a code scanner and you can go through and do that. But I think it's better if that's incumbent on the provider, because not everybody takes code, and especially open source code, and calls it Log4j. They could call it Log4f, and is that the same thing or not? At least with an SBOM, I can know that there's an attestation there that says that, hey, this is actually Log4j, and so I can have some sort of provenance to it, because they have to, that person that next tier down has to say, oh, my Log4f is actually based on an SBOM which has Log4j in it. And so, scanning is great, but it's not always going to dig you out when you've got a lot of dependencies that are tiered. And so that's why this is a new construct that we're sort of pushing that responsibility further and further and further down that software stack into the supply chain where it belongs. But that is great. I mean, that is an option. You can always do some form of scanning. There's lots of different people that do that, do application scanning for vulnerabilities. That's sort of, you think about it, that's sort of the basis for viruses, et cetera. The virus scanning we do is application scanning. And so I'll never say that that's a bad thing to do. I think you always have to independently verify, but I also think that it's great to now get more people on the hook to be able to help you do that process.
Yeah.
That's your question.
Yeah. And my quick next question is for the AI part, not considering the data about garbage in, garbage out, but you were talking about, let's say, AI being biased, being racist. Now I'm thinking, me being new to AI as well.
Well, all I said was that it's possible to manipulate it into that. I'm not saying it's inherently that way. It's just that's always that's an example of where that's come true because of the inputs. People had, when Microsoft did this, they had bad inputs, bad validity checking on the inputs, and so that's how it resulted.
Now I'm thinking just this is an idea throwing out, like probably like big companies or maybe the U.S. government could like state like you can only build on top of this certain LLM, which is already or I mean ongoing updates of removing those biases and some of the bad stuff.
I mean, well, I think what we need to do is we need to just be the thought that I had was we need to be very careful about how things get into an LLM, and that's at the initial formulation. but also as it
Mm.
being, the base, what makes an LLM exciting is the fact that it's evolving. And so we need to
Mm-hmm.
think about how that evolves and what controls we put in to allow that evolution to take place in a way that doesn't, set us off into, to a bad track, either in terms of manipulation or something else. And so what I was trying to point out was that that's an ongoing effort. And so,
Yeah.
LLMs, yes, it's great. We need to start out with a good static model that's initially good, but how we think about that over time is the essence of AI and LLMs that we're using today and where that takes us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Doug.
Okay, sure. Other questions?
Doug, I have
Sure.
multiple questions, but the first question, SolarWinds was about what, 3.5 years ago?
About that.
Is that about that? And now they are just now getting around to the prosecution. Is that a reasonable?
Well, I think what's happened is that there was there's been a lot of discussion about do they or don't they, and I think that the issue has gotten to so bad from a policy perspective in the government that they finally decided that it's time to do this. And so this was the SEC that's taking on the prosecution, and so this is now risen to the level of it's material for your earnings and your investors to know what your cybersecurity risk is. And that's what took a little while for this to become material. When you first happened, it wasn't as big, but the people didn't understand what the risk was, and then SolarWinds kind of compounded their problem by misrepresenting what happened and what went on. And that's really, it's as much in the misrepresentation as the fact that they were lacking stuff. But all I'm trying to say is that we've crossed that Rubicon. Now your process and your representations, your attestations have force. They're not just aspirational.
So with whom does the buck stop? When we're talking about this, because this is an area that I've always been fascinated with, who is ultimately going to be responsible? Does it go all the way up to the board of directors? Are they culpable? Is it the CFO, the CIO?
Well, the SEC has, at least in the SolarWinds case, has made the case that the corporation as an entity and the CISO as an individual is culpable, and so they're going after the CISO as one of the culpable parties, and I think that's a sea change in terms of how we're thinking about it. Boards always have some responsibility against civil suits and things like that at the corporate level, but this is a criminal prosecution. Well, this is a criminal prosecution for misrepresentation. A financial thing.
They can do time.
Yeah, and that's new for CISOs. I mean, we didn't have this issue until SolarWinds came around, and that's been in distance, as I said, the end of October. So this is literally 3 months, 3 months ago that this happened, and so this is a big sea change in terms of IT, and now it's going to ripple down because now as a CISO, I'm going to be really concerned about who my vendor is, where that stuff is coming from, and everything else. So there's this huge ripple down that's happening in the supply chain that wasn't, and there's an enforcing function that wasn't there previously.
So this is an important question. I would like to know, because when you were a CISO and even now, what keeps you up at night?
Oh, I'm actually 35. Lots of things keep me up at night. It's amazing I sleep at all. I think the thing that keeps me up most at night is really about, did I do enough to put enough process in place so that things get caught and nothing falls through the cracks. That's really, because that's the only thing I can control. I can't control individuals and actions they take. But what I can control is, do I have anything in my process that would catch that somebody didn't do what they were supposed to do, or that process wasn't followed, or that the outcomes aren't matching what needs to be done. And so that's what I really think about and worry about is the process working? Is the process enforced? Is the process complete? And if that's true, then that covers off a lot of these one-offs because they shouldn't happen because the process would take care of them. And if you're doing a good job of of segmentation and protecting your assets and things like that, then that lets you you can sleep better at night knowing that you're not that isn't causing issues. So that's the other piece of it. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Yes, that makes a lot of sense with everything that you were talking about. Does anybody else have another question? I don't want to hog all the questions here. Then I want to go back to your initial statement, because
Sure.
you said that the issue was in the seams. What do you consider the most vulnerable seams that exist in our systems today?
Identity. We've got bad token passing, bad API interfaces, bad things where people can do man-in-the-middle attacks, can do token stealing, cookie stealing, things like that. So anywhere there is identity seam, I think is a big one. The other one is that we don't create enough opportunity to sort of have the segmentation piece in terms of creating more seams that we can then have places where we can be able to isolate and be able to know where they are and where they're monitoring. But think about where folks are getting in and causing issues. They're getting in and causing issues because there's a seam between the human being and email. There's a seam between the code, the configuration, and what should be the right configuration for making sure that things are done right. There's a seam around your vulnerability management process. So there's lots of different seams in an organization. But what I like to focus on is that I like to pay attention to where there's obvious seams in my infrastructure, and that's, as I say, identity is a big one. API interfaces is a big one. Where the tunnels, where the ports are seams between the outside world and the inside world, and where those seams are in terms of my internal infrastructure. Do I have a seam between my important data and the next layer up in terms of my internal infrastructure that I'm monitoring and paying attention to? And so those are really areas that I care about. And so, it's kind of contrary. More seams are good, but making sure those seams are done correctly are important. So worrying about those seams is really something that is critical to think about, because that's everywhere that I've seen a problem. It's almost universally. It's been where there's been a seam, because it hasn't necessarily been inside of something that's monolithic. It's mostly been at the seams.
Thank you. Other questions? So
Hey, Doug, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good.
Hey, quick question, kind of a general thing, I guess I'll ask. Regarding the tech layoffs, specifically for software engineers, I've been hearing a lot in the news about kind of oversaturation in the market, making it extra competitive. Would you say that same principle kind of applies to the cybersecurity field as well, or are they doing a lot better, you'd say?
I think they're doing better in cybersecurity than they are in the general world. But I think it's universally true that if you're undifferentiated, it's like any other product. If you're undifferentiated, you're not going to be as attractive a product as if you're differentiated. And so even in cybersecurity, if you just come out and say, well, I'm just a general analyst, that's not as interesting as somebody who's got specific experience with SBOMs or a specific experience with or learnings or knowledge about a software development process or something like that. So I would, depending on where you're trying to target in terms of your job search, I would say that it's important that you do something to differentiate yourself, and then tell the world about it. I mean, do it through blog posting or through whatever mechanism you wish. But it's important that you get that word out there. But as I say, differentiating yourself where people are, where people are looking is important. Right now, there's a lot of opportunity for security around AI. People are just starting to figure out, oh, I have to worry about these things, like thinking through these threat models and validity and all those areas I was talking about that were important. And so that's a whole new area that opened up. And so what I'd be doing, if my recommendation, if that was something I wanted to focus on, was I'd have not only my cybersecurity chops, but I'd also make sure I understood Python and understood, how the large language models get put together and things like that would differentiate myself in that marketplace. Am I making sense, or is that helpful?
Yeah, it sounds like you're saying the more specialized you are, the safer you are, in essence, with the way the market's going.
Right. You never stop learning, and you never stop differentiating, and so it's a little bit about the fact that don't get too complacent in whatever you're doing. Try to skate to where the old hockey analogy of trying to skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it is. And so being your network is a huge piece of that, being able to talk to people in your network and understanding where the need is, and then making sure your skills align.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes total sense. Thank you.
Sure. Other questions? Well, we're at 5:27, and if there's no other questions,
Well, I have one quick one.
Sure.
In addition to differentiation, is there any other advice that you would have? Because we've got cybersecurity people here, we've got a lot of software people here,
Right.
we've got some data science. What is the advice that you would give them as somebody who is, you've even been to the White House and recommended policy. So what
Sure.
would you say to people starting out to get to where you are?
Basically that it's it's true that in most being able to be flexible, being able to recognize things that are out there, but really being able, when there's a time of crisis, to come in and help and solve the crisis. And so having the agility and the focus to take on those things and be helpful and do that is really, what gets you noticed and ahead. Oftentimes people come into corporations. I call it the doormat syndrome. You buy a new doormat and you comment on the doormat for the first 3 days, and after the fourth day, what doormat? You don't see it anymore. And so if you don't stick out somehow, it's very easy for anybody to get kind of lost into an organization, no matter how size it is. And so that's where you have to be always looking for opportunities to come in and solve problems. And that's really where I've seen a lot of career advancement happen to people, is that they wind up going on tiger teams, or they wind up saving a lot of money on something, or they wind up doing something that has an impact in the organization or solves a problem that arises. And that's how they get noticed, and that's how they be able to step up to the next level. And so that's why I can't emphasize enough having that flexibility, having that networking, having that presence to know what's sort of going on, and then making yourself useful in the organization is really what gets you differentiated and gets you the ability to get promoted and move forward. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. And I hope people would just turn on their cameras and be real people and thank Doug for donating this time to give you, really, come on, these are the people. Come on, Joel, Dan, Scott, everybody, turn your cameras on. Okay.
We are AI generated. No kidding.
Doug, thank you very much. Anybody else have a word of thanks? I don't want to do all the talking. Sandra, you there? Okay. Doug, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh,
I want to say thank you again.
Go ahead.
I just want to say thank you again, because it's the first time I've been to a security talk that really dove deep in many aspects in one shot. So thank you.
I like I could talk for days about any one of the topics I covered, and there's an infinite amount of depth in there. But what's nice is now you've got an overview, and you know how it all fits together, and you know where you can go, and then you can deep dive into any one of those areas and understand how it fits into the bigger context. And that's really important. That's I can't tell you enough how many times I've talked to folks and they lose track of where things fit, how they fit together, and that's the first step in understanding is have to know how the universe looks and where it fits, and then now you can go and do in depth in any one piece of that universe that's interesting to you, and you know where you fit in that puzzle, and you know how you're now making the whole better. And so that's really critical. So I appreciate that I was successful in doing that. So yay.
Yeah.
That was my goal. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, security is everyone's business, and Sam was at the beginning. He had to go to another meeting, and one of the things he's planning on doing is building secure coding into all of our courses. So you were well heard. This is
Okay,
really
good,
key.
good. Well, as I say, I can hardly recommend the security development lifecycle. That's tried and true and tested. There's lots of free tooling and materials and training and stuff that goes with that. There's a great organization called safecode.org, which I can hardly recommend. That again promotes the same sorts of principles, and I would go to safecode.org, and they are a great jumping off place. But I have the book here somewhere, but I have my security development lifecycle book, which I can definitely recommend by Lipner and Howard.
Okay, well, we will definitely be speaking with you.
Okay, thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right, bye.
Yes, so thank you for everyone. Yeah, good night.